Disclaimer: this story contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and other content that modern viewers might find upsetting. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres, and I will be continuing where I left off on Chapter 7. At the sound of Hyde's voice, Barbara gave a cry and half moved forward. Then, with an effort, she controlled herself and stood where she was in the doorway, her hands pressed tightly over her lips, her eyes straining towards the two men. She could not see Asher's face, but Edmund's she saw plainly, with its frankly amazed look and wavering smile. Then the hand which he had extended fell to his side, and he frowned. "Good heavens, man! What on earth's the matter?" he broke out irritably. "Aren't you going to ask me in? And what in the world are you doing in this benighted spot? Is it a game? Are you a second Robinson Crusoe, or Swiss Family Robinson, or something? And—" He broke off roughly, as, for the first time, he saw Barbara standing in the doorway behind Asher. The hot color rushed in an agitated wave to his good-natured face, and for a moment he could not speak. Then he stammered out, Barbara! Good heavens! What is the meaning of it?" Barbara spoke. Her words were punctuated with a little high, hysterical laugh. It's not in the least what it looks like, Edmund. It isn't a bit of romance, or... She gave a stifled cry. "Oh, don't let him shut the door! Don't let him shut the door!" For Asher had made a swift movement as if he would have closed it in Edmund's face. There was a momentary struggle, half-hearted on Asher's part, for he was still weak. Then Edmund forced his way into the narrow hall, where he stood flushed and rather breathless. "Now, if you'll have the goodness to explain what the devil this means, I shall be much obliged," he broke out angrily. "Hello, old chap, are you ill?" For Asher had swayed unsteadily. "Leave me alone." He steadied himself by the door frame. His face was hard and ugly, with a new anger and bitterness. "Who sent you here?" he demanded. "How did you find your way here? And what the devil do you mean by interfering with me?" His voice had risen threateningly. His face had flushed an ugly red, and yet he looked much more a sick man than a savage one, and Barbara took an involuntary step towards him. Edmund looked from one to the other with growing doubt and suspicion. Then he shrugged his shoulders. "If I am unwelcome, as it seems, I have no wish to stay. We have had no word from you since you left the house a fortnight ago, and we were naturally anxious. There were letters waiting, and at last I opened one. It was from Australia, and made a reference to this place. Heaven knows what made me think you might be here, but it did occur to me, and so I came along to investigate. You are mighty anxious for my welfare all at once." Asher sneered. Edmund flushed and paled, as if with some sudden emotion. "I naturally thought you were the proper one to turn to, in the circumstances," he said awkwardly. "Linda." Asher took a step forward. "We will leave my sister's name out of this conversation, if you please," he began stiffly, but Barbara interrupted, stepping hurriedly between the two men. "Edmund! Linda! What has happened?" she asked breathlessly. Edmund tried to answer. His face worked convulsively. Then suddenly he hid his face in his hands. "She's gone," he said hoarsely. "Gone?" Asher swayed forward and gripped his shoulder with merciless fingers. "You hound! What have you done to her? If anything has happened, I'll thrash you within an inch of your life. Rufus! Barbara caught his arm with both hands, dragging him away. "Oh, for heaven's sake! You'll hurt him! Oh, Edmund, don't! For my sake, don't!" For Edmund had made a furious rush at his brother-in-law. She stood between them, a frail barrier dividing their rage and passion. Then, as Edmund's hand fell to his side, she said quietly, "He doesn't understand. Mr. Asher doesn't understand. We shall have to tell him, at last." And there followed a tragic silence, during which the rage and passion died from Edmund's white face, and when he spoke it was very quietly, almost without expression, as if he had run through all his emotions and found himself bankrupt of more. "Linda went away 2 days ago with Hugh Langley. She left a note for you. I have it here. There was nothing for me." Linda went away with Hugh Langley?" Rufus Asher repeated the words vaguely. "Why, well, where has she gone? Why with him? Why, I don't understand." He put his hand to his forehead dizzily. "Why with Langley?" he asked again. Nobody answered. Barbara was watching him with pitiful eyes, and suddenly a glimmer of what they were trying to tell him seemed to force its way into his brain. His face flushed from chin to brow. His eyes narrowed. Then he broke out, almost shouting. "You infernal scoundrel! You're trying to blacken my sister's name to shield your own damnable conduct. You're trying to make me believe. I'll make you pay for this." But as he lunged forward, blinded with the strength of his own passion, he seemed to crumple and collapse, and but for Edmund's supporting arms, he would have fallen. Between them, they got him back into the sitting room and put him into the big chair. "What's the matter with him?" Edmund asked impatiently. "I feel as if I'm in some horrible nightmare." Barbara smiled. "These last days have been worse than a nightmare to me," she said faintly. "Look, he's coming round." Edmund walked over to the window and stood with his back turned, staring into the wood, and presently he heard Asher say, "Miss Weir, will you please leave us for a moment?" Barbara expostulated. "Why need I? You can have nothing to say that I do not know already. Please let me stay. Asher interrupted ruthlessly. "Will you please go?" And she walked out of the room without another word, closing the door behind her. Edmund turned round from the window. "Well," he submitted curtly. His brother-in-law was still sitting in the big chair, but he rose, keeping one hand on the chair back as he began to speak. I should like to have my say first, if you have no objection, and then I will listen to any lies you choose to tell me." The insult was deliberate, but Edmund took no notice, and the elder man went on. "The last night I was in your house, I unwittingly overheard a conversation on the veranda between you and Miss Weir. I had already discovered that my sister was unhappy in her marriage, and what I heard confirmed my suspicions that you were not playing the game. I saw Miss Weir in your arms. I heard the plans you made with her to meet in London the following day, and I made up my mind that these things should not happen." He stopped for a moment and drew a deep breath, and now his hand was clenched as it rested on the chair back. Then he went on more quietly. "I managed to travel to London with Miss Weir, and to send a couple of wires before we left your house, with the result that I was met in London by a motor car, in which I kidnapped her. Yes, I admit it," he said defiantly, as Hyde made an inarticulate sound. "I brought her down here, and have kept her here ever since, away from you, and where she could do no harm to my sister. I don't know what cock and bull story you have brought here with you, or how you managed to find us, but I have told you I opened a letter from Australia, which was marked urgent. Please forward immediately if left. And in it was an allusion to this cottage. As I said just now, I don't know what made me think you would be here, but something urged me to come." Asher interrupted sneeringly. "And now you can go as soon as you like, and you will not take Miss Weir with you, if, as I suppose, that is the reason you have come." Edmund's face hardened. "I hardly imagine, from what I can see, that Miss Weir would wish to leave you," he sneered. "But if you have any doubts, I can set your mind at rest. I'm not here for Miss Weir's sake at all, but for your sister's." He waited, but Asher did not speak, and the younger man said again, with a pathetic weariness, "Linda left my house 2 days ago with Langley. I have done all I can to find her, and have failed. My God, man!" he broke out in sudden agony. "Why weren't you there? Why have you stayed away like this? You might have saved her. You might have saved her." Asher tried to speak, but no words would come, and Edmund went on. "I'd had my doubts for some time, but I wasn't sure, and I was afraid to speak for fear of precipitating matters, though Barbie urged me to. She knew. She was right all along." He struck his hands together in pain. "Why didn't I listen to her? Why didn't I?" He paced away and came back agitatedly. "As for what you saw on the veranda," he made a contemptuous gesture, as if he were dismissing a thought unworthy of consideration in the face of the overwhelming tragedy that had come into his life. "You are either dreaming or you've exaggerated the whole thing. I'm not in love with Barbara Weir, or she with me. The thing's absurd. We're good friends, and I'm fond of her. She's been a brick to me. She's done her best with Linda. If I'd listened to her, none of this would have happened, if only I'd listened." Asher stood like a man turned to stone. There was something terrible in the expression of his eyes. He looked like a child who had been frightened by the story of a boogie, and who begs for contradiction. After a moment he broke out hoarsely. "But I heard you, man, I heard you. With my own ears I heard you make the arrangement to meet her in London. I heard you say that you were glad it was all at an end at last. I heard you say. You heard neither of us say anything we should have been ashamed of you hearing. And as for her being in my arms, pshaw! You make me tired. What the devil's the matter with you? Have you gone mad? There was a long silence. Asher stood staring before him, as if he had forgotten where he was, as if he had forgotten everything. Then he said slowly, as if he were talking to himself, "And I brought her here. I treated her like a dog. My God, will she ever forgive me?" Edmund moved uneasily. He had not realized the enormity of what Rufus had done. He could think only of his wife and his own tragedy, and he said again in blind rage, "If you'd been there, Linda would not have gone. She loved you. She would have listened to you. I've done my best, heaven knows, but I suppose I failed. But to leave me for that cur, if ever I find him." He began to pace the room like a madman. Rufus seemed to have forgotten him. Presently he turned slowly and walked to the door. He opened it and stood for a moment staring into the narrow hall, which was growing dark with shadows. Barbara was there, sitting on the bottom stair, her eyes wide with fear and apprehension, her face white. For a moment they looked at one another silently. Then Asher said in a difficult voice, "Why didn't you tell me, Barbara? Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you? What was there to tell?" "What a fool I was! What an unpardonable fool!" The faintest smile flickered through her eyes. "Would you have believed me?" she asked. They both knew he would not. They both knew that no matter how hard she had tried to make him understand, her words would have fallen on deaf ears. It seemed a long time before either of them spoke again. Then Barbara said, with a cynical note in her voice, "I suppose this means that my imprisonment is at an end, and that I am free to go." He seemed not to hear. Presently he spoke out. "You will never forgive me. You will never forgive me, or believe how humiliated, how indescribably grieved." The words were halting, inadequate, and yet they came from his heart. Barbara smiled. "If my forgiveness is worth anything to you, you may have it," she said, "but no sorrow of yours will wipe out this past fortnight. When people know that I was here with you, my life will be ruined, and nothing you can say or do will alter that." There was a burning flush in her face. She felt as if her heart had grown numb to her position, and that today it had awakened again, and was scorching her. She did not raise her eyes as she walked into the room where Edmund waited. She went up to him, and her whole body was shaken with sobbing, and the tears rained from her eyes as she clutched his arm. "Take me away from here! Take me away!" she said. And that is the end of Chapter 7 of The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you join me for the rest of the book soon. Have a great day.